A big hello to everybody and thank you for joining us for this webinar brought to you by the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel. I will be introducing them to you in turn. We are, of course, talking about the huge changes to work that have been brought by COVID-19, by the pandemic. And we know from early research that as people around the world, in the UK, but in many places around the world, including where I am in Australia, that as we have moved to virtual work, working from home, that it is women who have disproportionately picked up the extra load. Already research has shown that women have disproportionately picked up the extra domestic load, including the load associated with caring for children at home and homeschooling. In this webinar, we are going to discuss what are employers doing about this? And on this question, we are informed by new research which has been carried out in partnership with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership by employee research agency Carey & Box. We're very thankful to them for the work that they've done. This is incredibly interesting research which reveals the lengths that people have had to go to balance work and caring responsibilities during the pandemic, the potential career penalty they may face as a result, and it interrogates what employers are doing about it, and we are going to discuss what more needs to be done. But to take us through the research in the first instance, I'm delighted to be able to introduce James Tarbert, who is the Managing Director, Client Advisory at Carey & Box. He was previously the Global Head of Employee Insight at HSBC and has long-standing experience in advising executive and non-executive boards on insight, strategy and change. I know you're going to be fascinated by the material he has to present. So James, over to you.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for giving us the opportunity to conduct the research with you and giving me the opportunity to come and talk you through it today. I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides to share with you. So hopefully everyone can see that now. And I think what this report shows is that whilst many companies have made some quite solid steps to help employees with parent or caring responsibilities, they still have some way to go to ensure they're truly meeting those needs, particularly in the current challenging environment. And for some organizations, it just hasn't really entered the agenda or entered the thoughts at all. Now, we conducted research earlier this year with almost 100,000 employees in the UK that looked at how organizations were meeting the initial challenge of COVID. And generally, employees felt that their organizations had done quite well. They'd mobilized quickly and effectively to ensure that employees could remain productive during lockdown or had the right safety equipment if they were continuing to work on site. And leadership and manager communications had significantly increased, which led to an employee workforce that generally felt quite calm and quite motivated. And of course, very necessarily, all that activity went hand in hand with considerable additional support for home and flexible working. And previous research we've conducted, either with clients or publicly, has shown that organizations have been able to pivot to supporting flexible working in its broadest sense quite well, often surpassing some quite low employee expectations of how their organizations can deal with these things. And the research that we've conducted with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership supports those findings. So over 90% of organizations said that support for home working had increased since the start of the pandemic. 79% of organizations said that support for home working had increased since the pandemic. And the research also shows just how necessary that additional support was. So when we asked how parents, carers, employees with those kind of home responsibilities had dealt with it, even with all of that additional support that was coming from their organization, the majority of them had to use annual leave to cover the period where schools were locked down or the summer holidays. Almost a third had to reduce their working hours, and there were considerable minorities who had to either take unpaid leave or worse, ask for voluntary furlough. So when there were furlough schemes going on in the UK, people were saying, "Look, I have to do it because I can't look after the children any other way." So a considerable proportion of employees with those responsibilities were having to use additional measures outside of any support that the organizations were giving, but that organizations had moved quite quickly to provide that support. So in the initial phase, so far, so good. But what's also clearly emerged from the research is a gap between those initial and those general levels of support for flexible working and the more specific support that's going to be required for those employees with those caring responsibilities in the coming period, whether that's 6, 12 months, however long the pandemic stays with us, and therefore the organisation or government response from a point of view of policies around lockdown, around taking children out of school persist. Because whilst 64% of organisations said, yes, we have clear policies in place to support parents and carers in our organisation, when we asked about more specific policies to deal with short-term flexible working requirements in the coming period, that dropped to 50%. And in both of those cases, fewer than half of the organisations said that knowledge of those policies is universal within those line manager populations. So even when organisations are doing the right thing and are instilling policies or processes to protect employees with difficult home situations or with the need to care for children in the coming period, not all line managers are even aware of it or therefore can actually communicate it to the employees that might need it. We also saw lack of evidence of this lack of foresight in terms of the return to school this academic year, which has obviously just been going on in the past week or so. So again, only half of organisations that we surveyed said they were actively planning for any challenges that would arise out of children returning to school. And of those, there was actually little sense that if they were putting policies in place to treat parents consistently, if they didn't want to send their children back to school because they were in high case areas, or if they had concerns, again, there was very little consistent policy or process going on in organisations to actually be able to deal with parents in those kind of situations. So again, a picture where, whereas there's been support in the past, as we think about the coming school term, as we think about the challenges that will be faced where children have to be removed, certainly in the UK, for a period of a week or two if someone in their class shows coronavirus symptoms or is positive for a test, then the policies, the support from organisations is not there. And again, even when they are, the visibility is not universal amongst the line manager population. So this is painting a picture of organisations that have gone so far in terms of their support, but that they're not upweighting that support just to help employees in this situation in the coming months. Perhaps most concerningly of all, the research shows there's potential for future workforce decisions in organisations to have an undue impact on parents and carers. So 40% of the organisations we surveyed, and remember this was over 200 organisations in multiple sectors, 40% of those organisations said they were actively planning to make redundancies in the coming year. And performance and absence were both major factors when selecting employees for redundancy. So either employees that had poor performance or employees that had been absent for a prolonged period of time, those were the kind of factors that went into organisational and line manager communication as in conversations when they talk about which employees to make redundant. Now, when we asked them what advice they had in place for those managers to help mitigate against selection where performance or absence had been impacted by COVID-19, only a minority of organisations said that they had those policies in place. So 48% of organisations say, yes, we have policies in place that when someone's performance has been adversely affected by either the need to look after their children or an absence due to COVID-19, that we could take that into account when we're making a redundancy decision, and less still for absence. So twinned with the fact that only about a third of companies said they provide advice to line managers on how to handle performance conversations with those individuals, so with individuals whose ability to deliver has been impacted by the additional caring needs, this paints a very worrying picture. That effectively we might be in a situation where companies will be taking quite long-term decisions around either workforce makeup or around the number of employees that are being exited from the organisation and which employees, and they're not going to be consistently taking into account the experience that parents or carers have had or will continue to have in the coming months when taking those decisions. So I think this report, in a nutshell, talks about the fact that organisations have done quite a lot. And again, research we've conducted over the past 6 months shows that in general, employees are more positive about the organisational response to coronavirus than many governmental responses to coronavirus. But that as the situation persists and changes, organisations need to do more to either create specific policies to support employees with caring responsibilities, or more importantly, where those policies exist, actually make sure that all line managers are aware of them and can have those conversations with employees with those responsibilities to make sure that they're not adversely affected, either in terms of their career within the organisation or in terms of any decision around having to leave the organisation through a redundancy process. So I think those are the main findings, and now we're going to go, is it Sarah, I think, who's going to either respond to that or have a general comments around what we've found so far.
Thanks, James. Thank you so much for sharing those insights, and plenty to talk about there. And I am going to call on our other two panellists now to respond. And I invite audience members to be starting as they listen to the contributions to send their questions through. I will be posing some questions myself to the panel, but I'll also be drawing on your ideas to formulate questions. So please use the Q&A function for that. First, I'm going to call to respond to those insights and statistics, Sonia Soda. Sonia is a chief leader writer and columnist at The Observer and deputy opinion editor at The Guardian. Before working in journalism, she was a senior policy advisor to Ed Miliband and also worked in senior policy roles in the charity sector. Sonia, what's your take on what you've heard from James and on these issues generally?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Julia. And I should start off by saying a big thank you to the Global Institute for Women's Leadership for the work you do in general, but also I think this is a really important piece of research that takes us on in our understanding about how the pandemic will impact on women and parents' employment, not just in the here and now, but I think in the medium term as well, which is a really critical insight to have. I remember at the start of when this was all kicking off, there was a lot of quite hopeful talk, I think, which was that, you know, this is a massive crisis. We can't let a good crisis go to waste. Hopefully this is going to transform our approach to things like the environment, like gender, like work-life balance. And I remember being quite skeptical at the time, but now I guess I'm even more skeptical. And I think it's a sort of tempting way to think, but it's also quite a lazy way to think that we're going to get transformative change on big social issues out of a crisis. I think actually, usually crises, massive shocks to GDP, whether it's because of a financial crisis or because of a pandemic like this one, they inevitably usually end up accentuating existing inequalities in society. And I think that's what we're seeing when it comes to the gap between the rich and the poor. I think it's what we're seeing when it comes to gender. I think it's what we're seeing when it comes to the attainment gap between more advantaged and less affluent children. So there was some hope, but I do think now that we're in it, it's becoming quite evident that this could take us backwards, and there is a real risk this takes us backwards. And I think that's what the research that James just presented really shows. And I guess what I would like to do is maybe sort of take a step back and think about what challenges this poses us from a sort of societal and a kind of policy perspective, as well as for individual employers. And I do think that one tiny silver lining of this terrible crisis might be that at least it pulls back the corner on some of these inequalities, and it's really thrown them up in our faces. So, you know, I've got friends, and it is inevitably usually mums, although there are obviously dads who are sort of taking the weight as well. But, you know, this week with kids going back to school, I've already got two friends who are in the position of children having been sent home from school, can't get a test anywhere, kids are missing time off their new school, mums are having to rearrange work. I mean, this is not over. It's sort of continuing to have an impact. So I really think that hopefully at least it will provide us with another opportunity to talk about deep-seated labour market inequalities that have existed for a long time, and which, quite frankly, we as a society have just not done enough about. And so I think if you take a step back from all this and you think about what would a society that really has good gender equality both in the workplace and at home, what would that look like, and how do we get there? Perhaps a pandemic, perhaps this sort of research does provide us with another platform to talk about that. And for me, I guess there are two things. The first big challenge is how we get men and women, mums and dads, sharing more of the work at home, the caring and the domestic responsibilities, as well as being more equal in the workplace. And I think the two go hand in hand. We know that what is holding women back in the workplace, we know this has happened for decades, we know it's going to happen more as a result of what's happened in recent months, is needing to work flexibly and part-time. And we know that going part-time is one of the biggest blocks on a women's career. It also impacts fathers who want to work flexibly. So I think it's really important, although this has a massive gendered impact at a societal level, it also makes it very difficult for dads on an individual level who want to do the right thing, who want to take more caring responsibilities. There's actually massive social stigma around them doing so, and they can face a penalty as well. So I think it's important to remember that it applies to dads. So, for me, it's really, how do we get to a society where men and women do more at home and they have more equal workplace progression? But I also think there's a sort of secondary thing here, which again, we've been talking around in the pandemic, which is around work-life balance. And really, I'm not sure a society where the aspiration is for both parents to work full-time and have, amazing professional lives that rely on, full-time, 5-day-a-week working, plus having to do all the caring responsibilities on top. Is that really a society that we want to live in? And I think the debates that we're having at the moment about a shorter working week and better work-life balance are really important. And to me, it just doesn't make sense. As we've moved to 2-earner households, why is the assumption that really what's ideal is one parent working 5 days a week and the other working 3 or 4 days a week, or both parents working 5 days a week? Why isn't the assumption that actually as we've moved to a society with 2-earner households, both parents might work 3 or 4 days a week each? And that is actually a much healthier way to do things that would enable fathers to do more at home. And it would also potentially radically transform progression opportunities for part-time and flexible employees in the workplace, because we know that as long as it is women taking time off work to have children and taking, who are taking the hit on their careers by working part-time and flexibly, workplaces are never, ever going to be set up to ensure equitable progression of people who work part-time and flexibly when you have got predominantly men working long hours in the workplace. Like, workplaces will still be geared around that sort of progression model. So I think it's really important to sort of take a step back and say, well, actually, if we're all in agreement that what we want is a society where people work less, but mums and dads both work less, it's not mums working less, but dads working full time, how do we get there? And I hope that this moment provides us with an opportunity to ask those questions. I personally think that we need to think about ways that make it completely socially acceptable for dads to work flexibly. I think there are some really encouraging signs in the fact that, millennial fathers tend to say that they want to be doing more, but it is still very difficult for men. We know that when men go and ask workplaces to go part-time or work flexibly, particularly in male-dominated workplaces, where macho stereotypes kind of are quite sort of prevalent, it can be very difficult for them. It is not socially acceptable for them to do. So how do we shift that? Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I really think we need to take a page out of Iceland's book, Use It or Lose It, Parental Leave for Dads. Obviously that is tough for women because it might come out of mothers' allowances. But I just think while women are compensated way more to stay at home from work in the first year than men, it is, couples are never going to be able to make it work financially so that men take time out in the first year while they've got a baby to care for their baby full time. We know that's a transformative experience. We know those men are much more likely to share equally in the domestic work later on. They're more likely to work flexibly later on. It's not just something that, lasts 3 months. And yet it is very difficult for men to do at the moment because it doesn't pay off financially and it is difficult to ask for. So in Iceland, both parents have to take at least 3 months of the parental allowance. It's use it or lose it. It's compensated on an equitable basis between mothers and fathers. And it has transformed the social stigma, as I understand it, around men asking to take time off. Because basically, if you don't take those 3 months, they're gone and you don't get that subsidy from the state. So I really think we need to think about something quite radical. I mean, I don't even think it's that radical, but I think we need to think about something transformative like that. I don't think we're going to shift social attitudes unless we have I don't think it can just come from good employers either. I just don't think good employers operating at the margins are going to be enough to engender this kind of social transformation. It has to come from policy. It has to be set by government. So I think that would be a great first step. I think the other thing that I would really like to see is I would like to have us to have, while I really like the debate about a 4-day working week, one of my frustrations is that very, very few proponents actually talk about how you would achieve it. And the fact is, I think I'm a big fan of it, but I think it's very, very difficult to achieve in this day and age. Historic reductions in the working week have taken place as a result of unionized workforces and unions agreeing reductions in average working time of the working week over time. We are not that sort of workplace anymore. So all that's going to happen is professionals who can negotiate 4-day working weeks and can afford to take a bit of a salary hit will do so, and people who work in low-paid jobs where they don't have good employment rights, they will see absolutely no change whatsoever. So I really think that encouraging parents to earner households to think about both working less could be sort of quite a transformative way of moving towards the 4-day working week. So instead of thinking about it as a way of thinking about it would be parents leading the way and us trying to establish a social norm where the question isn't, are you going to go part-time if you're a parent? It's really, oh, you're a parent, why aren't you thinking about working 3 or 4 days a week? And obviously that's very, very difficult if you're in low income work, very hard. So it's got to come with revolutionising the way that we think about low pay and rights at work for the low paid. Otherwise this is just going to become a sort of middle class debate. But I really think we should be aspiring to live in a society where no parent works 5 days a week, would be my take on it. So anyway, that's sort of taking a very big step back from this very important piece of research, but I just wanted to chuck those bigger picture ideas in there because I think it's really important not to lose sight of the big prize and how a debate in the here or now might take us there.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was fantastic. And I'm going to turn now for our third contribution to Sarah Churchman. Sarah is the Chief Inclusion, Community and Wellbeing Officer at PwC in the United Kingdom. She's a human resources professional with over 30 years experience, including 15 years in the area of diversity and inclusion. And so, Sarah, you've had not a lot of experience with pandemics, where we're all learning as we go on pandemics, but a lot of experience in this area. How are you seeing it, and what are your reflections on James's research presentation?
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you, James, and also Sonia. I'm sitting here thinking, blimey, how to follow that. Sonia, I can't believe we've never met before because so much of what you said, from my perspective, made complete sense, because I do think as a pretty large employer, many of the challenges we face in really driving inclusion within our own organisation butts up against some of the social norms and the perceptions that people feel they have to conform to when it becomes, when we get to parenting specifically. So I often feel that we're trying to kind of change society from the microcosm that is PwC. But James, the research I think is so helpful. I think it's really important that we have these sorts of pieces of research just to keep these issues on the radar of employers. And I'm party to many kind of member organisations, and I know equality, maintaining equality, continuing to focus on diversity and inclusion is seen by many as a challenge through this pandemic. But I think research like this keeps it front of mind, and that's what we need. We need to keep it front of mind. So really helpful, somewhat depressing, I would say, the research, but gives us good stuff to work on. I also think, however, that it's telling those of us who are working in organisations, leading teams, working with people, and during the pandemic, ensuring that we're staying really close to our people, it's telling us kind of what we know already. We know that parenting during the pandemic, during lockdown, has been, let's face it, for a considerable number of people, a complete and utter nightmare. And I think work-life balance, I came into the diversity field 20 years ago on the back of a big piece of research, government-led, looking at work-life balance issues in the UK. And I think work-life balance is a very personal thing. I think it's always hanging by a thread. It's a fine balance. And I think it's a precarious balance, I think, as well sometimes. And it only takes one element in that change of command, if you like, in terms of how people organise their balanced lives to go wrong, for it to be completely ruined. So it's really been tested to the limits during this pandemic. My view is how well employers have done, including my own organisation, in supporting their people, very much links to their state of maturity in terms of some of their people practices and policies already, and particularly their focus on inclusion, the culture they're trying to create to ensure they are supporting all of their people, whatever their background, whatever their circumstances. But also, I think their maturity on the well-being agenda, the health and well-being of their people, particularly as we've seen during this pandemic, the mental well-being of their employees. So I think, speaking from my own perspective at PwC and the work that we've done supporting our 22,000 people here in the UK, I think the foundations that you had and you'd already built were really fundamental in terms of how you moved through this pandemic. And I think we've just released the first segment of our annual report today, actually, our FY20 annual report. And it talks right up front of our focus on our values, and our values include caring for our people, reimagining the possible, and working together. Those three values were absolutely fundamental as we responded to this pandemic. But it also talks of the need to focus on the health and the mental health and well-being of our people throughout, and also continuing to prioritise and embed a culture of inclusion that supports the diversity of our people. I think alongside that, our mantra, if you like, our people strategy at PwC is to empower our people, our 22,000 people, to be the very best they can be. And part of that has been a number of key interventions over the last 5 years, one of which has been a massive investment in collaborative technologies, which has been a huge benefit to us as a global network of firms in 157 countries, supporting our people to stay connected. And that's really been vital. So during those first few weeks of lockdown, the first 100 days, and this is a stat I've just taken from our annual report, actually, during the first 100 days, we had over 1 million virtual meetings of our people here in the UK, engaging 4.5 million of individual meetings across our 22,000 people. So staying really connected to our workforce was really fundamental, and technology really enabled that. And then another key element of our, our approach to empowering our people was excuse me, supporting what we call everyday flexibility. We're a professional services firm. We do work long hours. We're known for the long hours that we do work. And that can be a real test when it comes to work-life balance. But empowering our people over the last 5 years to give them the decision-making, if you like, over where, when, and how they work, enabled by technology, has also been a really good foundational element in terms of how we've responded to this pandemic. The research talks a lot about policies, having policies in place. We haven't made many policy changes at all, but what we have done is produce quite detailed guidance for both our people, but also our people managers. And we've chosen to, if you like, adopt, like many organisations, having a COVID site where people go, one source of the truth for all the information, latest update from governments, how we're responding, from government and how we're responding. But one source of the truth in terms of how to take care of yourself, how we're supporting those who are managing caring responsibilities during this pandemic. Time is money at PwC. Everyone charges their time. We provided additional codes for parents and carers so they could charge their time. I think policy, you can have all the policies in the world, but enabling people to feel able to use them, I think, is another matter. So we found very little usage of our code for parents and carers because we didn't want them to take unpaid leave or holiday, etc., etc. So what we found was the majority of our people were just working very long hours, and including people in my own team. So it very much fell to us working with our people managers to stay close to their people, to ensure they did understand the pressures that our people were facing, signposting them to the relevant sources of support, signposting them to other people in the team who also had childcare challenges, because most people just want to talk to somebody who's experiencing exactly the same as them. We had many online sessions with doctors, with medics, with psychologists, psychiatrists, helping our people to understand that the anxiety they were feeling at every stage of this pandemic was completely normal, and then supporting them in how we all as individuals can respond and how we can support each other to respond as well. So lots of guidance, lots of signposting to the support that's there through some of our providers like My Family Care, Bright Horizons. But I think what came out of all of this was it didn't matter what level you were at in our organisation. Everybody at every level, well, not everybody, but people at every level of our organisation have families, whether that's caring for dependents, those who were isolating, or children. And empathy levels, not a word often used in business, but empathy levels, I went through the roof. We can often sympathise, but we can't almost always empathise. And I think that ties really neatly to our prioritisation going forward of the need for compassionate leadership. We were doing a lot of work from a wellbeing perspective on the need for compassion, but I think the pandemic has really highlighted that now, the need for compassion, supporting our people. We have not furloughed anybody. In fact, our partners have taken the financial brunt of this pandemic. And I guess metrics are really important in all of this. We have gone through our year-end performance management process, and I'm really pleased to see that there has not been an impact on women in the firm. And in fact, at PwC, the underlying trend is if you are female, you're more likely to be highly rated than if you are male. Our challenge is making sure that that comes through to promotions, but it's really encouraging for us to see that this hasn't adversely impacted how our women are evaluated and how their performance is therefore measured. So I'm sure we have an awful lot more to learn, but I think we've been very conscious that we need to learn throughout this pandemic for the future.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm actually going to throw to James now a couple of questions on the research that are coming in on the Q&A line. And I should say that there will be a link to the research on the chat line so people can get copies of the research themselves. But James, two questions you might want to comment on. One is whether there is data that shows the ratio of men to women who took options like furlough or reduced pay or unpaid leave to cope during the pandemic and to balance their responsibilities. And there's another question about, do you have any insight into how powerful is the correlation between having a policy and real felt changes at work?
Thanks. So on the former, nothing in our research, certainly, but I've seen research elsewhere that suggests that women have borne an unusually high brunt of some of the either the furlough or indeed kind of the job losses so far. I think I saw one stat, I think it was a McKinsey report, it generally is, that said that women make up about 40% of the workforce, but actually they've lost about 50-55% of the jobs in that period of time. So there's been an undue impact on women's roles, certainly, whether that's to do with furlough or not. On the second one, yes, absolutely. We did have a look at what the impact of having a policy has. And both in terms of perceptions of the impact of coronavirus on job potential, job opportunities, and also in terms of the ability for people to share their concerns. And one of the things that we looked at as an additional focus of this research was psychological safety in organizations, psychological safety being the ability to share one's opinion, to share a concern without undue fear of negative consequence. And yet, whenever there was a policy in place, yes, employees felt more able to share their concerns. Yes, employees felt that their job potential, their job opportunities within the organization had been less impacted by COVID-19. That said, it still didn't stop them from having to use annual leave and unpaid leave and et cetera, to get around those things. Those things still exist. If you have parent caring responsibilities, you still need to take that time off. It's just that people tended to feel a bit more comfortable about it as a result of those policies being in place. I think there's an interesting debate, and I think Sarah's referenced it certainly in her comments, around what's the right thing to do. Is it to try and change behavior? Is it to put a policy in place? I mean, the one good thing about policy is that it provides a fairly solid bedrock on which any behavior or mindset in your organization is built on. And it can also be very powerful. The most powerful use of a policy related to flexible working I've ever seen literally changed one sentence. And whereas previously the policy had been the employee needs to prove the benefits of flexible working to them, and changing it to the manager needs to prove that it will have an undue impact on that employee's role. It only took a few word changes and all of a sudden flexible working in that organization burgeoned as a result. So policies can be quite neat ways of engaging the organisation and getting quite a lot of cultural change quite quickly and quite painlessly without having to spend loads of money on consultants.
Thank you. Now, I've got a few questions coming in that I'm going to throw to the whole panel and ask you to comment on. I'll just say on the statistics, we've had a participant say that women are 14% more likely to be furloughed and 50% more likely to have lost their job. So they're the statistics for the group. We've got some questions coming in around the set of issues really, Sonia, you raised and Sarah, you added to. First, there's a question about whether it's time in the UK to move to a model of leave for fathers where if you don't use it, you lose it. So the Nordic style models that have been seen to make a difference to the distribution of care for children and domestic labour, should that be on the agenda of the UK government? Should that be something people are agitating for? There's also a question, James, which really builds on what you just said about the right to request. We've got a participant pointing to the fact that the government actually indicated that it would take some steps to try and support flexible work. And the question really is, if the government's going to get serious about that, should it be re-engineering the right to request into something more powerful? Now, clearly, that would have a business reaction, because the more prescriptive it gets, the more business will react against it. But if I could just invite you for quick contributions around those issues. Sonia, what if I throw to you first?
Sure. So it won't come as a surprise to anyone to know that I am very much in favour of use it or lose it, leave for fathers. But there was an interesting question that I saw there, actually. I think it was from Patricia Hewitt, who talked about why the Labour government didn't do it when they were in government. And it's because there wasn't much demand from fathers and there wasn't much support from unions. And I think this is a genuinely difficult issue for governments, because really what someone like me is asking our government to do is be ahead of the curve in terms of what demand is, because the fact is actually the demand isn't really there because people are conforming to social norms, and you kind of need policy to act as a catalyst to change social norms around this and help create the demand for fathers to be staying at home. So I think it is genuinely quite tricky for governments that are led by public opinion. When I've written about this issue, I've sort of implored actually to us as women that we need to be arguing for this. And it might be a slightly sort of funny thing. Oh, sorry, that's my, sorry, that was my sister calling me on FaceTime. Whoops. But I think for women, we need to sort of be a bit honest with ourselves, actually, because it can feel a bit weird. And I think there are some excellent, feminists out there like Foresight Society who are arguing for this, who recognise that actually it is right that we argue for more workplace rights for fathers, because until we get those, we women are going to be held back. But that is, I think, a slightly maybe uncomfortable thing to get our heads around as women sometime. And I remember back when I was working at a think tank at Demos about 10 years ago, my boss had been a stay-at-home father for 5 years while he wrote a book while his wife actually worked at PwC. And he kind of offered us at Demos, he was like, I'm willing to give everyone the same parental leave, but I will have to cut maternity leave. And everyone was like, no, God, no. And I think that was presented as too raw a trade-off. But I also think that, there are trade-offs in this. So, if the government was going to make an extra 3-month block of parental leave available at really decent replacement rates of pay and to oblige employers to sort of do good income replacement for it, I think that should go to fathers. But there is a trade-off in that, because then we're saying it doesn't go to mothers. But I think we have to make these difficult decisions as a society. And I think, I think women, if we're being really honest, and I remember when I've written about this issue before, about use it or lose it daddy leave, I interviewed somebody that I knew who's the CEO of a charity, and she worked 3 days a week and her husband worked 3 days a week in quite a senior role at a big corporate, and he job shared with another man, which at that point was very unusual. In fact, I think it probably still is quite unusual. But I had a really honest conversation with her, because she said to me, I had actually been a stay-at-home mum before becoming a CEO of this charity, and there were difficulties for me as well in sharing the parental roles at home. Like, you know, like I had to lose a bit of my identity and give that up and share that aspect with my partner, even as I was owning a new identity in the workplace. And so I don't think these are like simple black and white things. And I think that government has to be ahead of social norms and ahead of the social curve on this. I think that's what makes it difficult. But I think that's why we elect governments. That's why we have political leaders, so they can show us a bit of leadership on this issue and do stuff that there maybe isn't massive public demand for. Come on, they've done it in Iceland, we can do it here.
Sarah?
Well, I want to be a bit optimistic here. I remember when the shared parental leave regulations were coming into force in the UK, and certainly I consulted with a number of our dads here at PwC, and their reaction was, "Oh no, I wouldn't take, I wouldn't take longer than my 2 weeks, my fully paid 2 weeks." So that was all a little bit depressing. But fast forward, actually over 1,000 dads at PwC have taken shared parental leave, anything from weeks to months. And I think social attitudes are changing. And many of our dads do want to be more hands-on parents, particularly in those first 12 months of their child's life. I think what's really interesting is for a number of years, when I've worked with our female talent and supporting them to progress their careers, when they've asked me for advice, the bit of advice that I always think makes them look at me slightly askance and a bit weirdly is I say to our young associates, senior associates, choose your partner, your life partner very carefully, because if you are ambitious, if you want to progress your career, don't shack up with somebody who's going to expect you to do 100% of the domestic chores and be the primary and sole carer. So there is something about, we all have to take the responsibility for this. But I do think attitudes are changing, and I certainly see our millennial male talent wanting to work in a different way and to be more hands-on fathers and parents. Thank
you, James.
The perennial chicken and egg of government policy or social norm. I loved Sonia's very optimistic when governments are led by public opinion. Sadly, I've never found a government that isn't led by public opinion. I did think that when the Fixed Term Parliaments Act came in 2010 in the UK, that might, albeit for a marriage of convenience between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats at the time, give a government enough space between one election and another to take quite a potentially unpopular ahead of public opinion decision and get to see the results play out before they're having to fight another election. But it wasn't to be. It's difficult. I think you're right in what you were saying about companies won't react well to being told to make significant budgetary policy changes if the demand isn't there. That said, I do think that most employees understand the need and the benefit of working more flexibly, particularly in the current situation. I think it was something that, again, Sonia said in her initial comments around the fact that the pandemic had pulled back the corner in some ways. And whenever we do research, either with individual clients, generally I'm talking about now, we certainly have seen lots of preconceptions being challenged. I mentioned psychological safety before. All of a sudden, we have lots of people saying they're more happy to share their opinion because everyone is equal. It used to be in a situation where 5 people were in a room having a meeting and 1 person was on video call. And the person who was on video call never got to say anything, never got to share their opinion because everyone was having side chats. All of a sudden, everyone's on a level playing field, and so you're hearing different opinions. You're seeing different things. So the kinds of preconceptions that people had before the pandemic are clearly being challenged in a major way. And when all of that's being thrown up in the air anyway, it's not such a bad time to try and do something a little bit bolder, a little bit braver.
James, I'm going to adopt your terminology, peeling back the corner, and I feel like in terms of the questions coming in now, the research and the discussion to date has peeled back the corner, but people are asking us to go a bit deeper. And of the things they're asking us to go a bit deeper around, we've had a discussion, much of it directed at families that are 2 parents and the caring obligation is children. We're now being asked by people in the question stream to consider what the research and what the perspectives around the pandemic and beyond mean for single parent families. So one of our questioners is saying a quarter of households in the UK are single-headed and 90% of these are headed by women. So, you know, what's the extra set of challenges here and what can we do about that? There's a question too that's asking us to think about the intersectional challenges that can come when having caring responsibilities might be one thing that has got implications for a work-life balance, but it's not the only thing. There's issues of race or disability or potentially other things. How can we get that into the analysis? And there's also questions here about whether or not we are truly seeing leaders, CEOs, senior executives, even those in government, walk the talk, actually show, whether it's in the context of the pandemic or more broadly, that they're prepared to exhibit these new behaviours and consequently send that message that this is the new norm, if not for all of society, at least for their workplace. So once again, I'll do a swing around and please let me know what you think. Sorry, I should just add there, just on the diversity of perspectives, there are also questions about the sort of sandwich generation. So where it's not, yeah, there may still be caring for kids, but that's not the only thing that's going on. There's caring for aged parents. So let me just go around the group. Sonia, once again, I'll go to you.
Thanks, Julia. Yeah, so first of all, on the point about government walking the walk, they are absolutely not. And actually, I think one of the reasons, I mean, I've been really critical of this government in terms of its approach to this pandemic, not just around parents and carers, but around children and young people in general. And I think this government has absolutely failed a generation of children and young people because it hasn't put enough thought into how to mitigate the very long-term impacts this pandemic is going to have on this generation. Obviously, you know, coronavirus affects them less from a health perspective, but it is going to have massive long-term impacts in terms of education, mental health, etc. And I think part of the reason why that has been missing, both when it comes to parents and carers, but also children, and obviously the two are very interlinked, is because we have such an undiverse government. And we have a government predominantly of men, but not just of men, but people who, you know, live on higher incomes, are much more affluent, who are much more likely to have paid nanny support, for example, at home, who are much more likely to have kids in private school where they're getting much more interaction with teachers. And I just don't think there is enough experience in government of experiencing this as a normal family would, or as an average family would, or as a typical family would, or, you know, there's no such thing as a typical family, so the whole breadth of experiences. So you know, I think this really came out when we had ministers showing off over the summer about how they were working round the clock on this pandemic. That is not walking the walk when it comes to setting a model for parents, and lots of them are parents themselves. So it's kind of like, well, if you're working round the clock, you know, what does that, you've obviously got someone looking after your kids around the clock, whether it's your partner or someone else. So I don't think this government have enough experience in the cabinet table about what it is, the pressures on family life as a result of this pandemic, and I think it shows in policy. Very briefly on single parents, thank you for raising that. It's incredibly important. I've got a friend who's a single mum, and it's even harder. It's so much harder to manage homeschooling, etc., when you don't even have the sort of on paper somebody with you to sort of go on that journey with you. So and again, I think there's been very little thought put to that in policy. I thought the support bubble came way too late, and you know, that would have really impacted on single parents if we could have had that earlier. There's very little thought given to childcare around single parents, so I think it's really important. And then very, very briefly on sandwich carers, I think it says something about us as a society that actually, when we say carers, we mean predominantly children. And this is a whole other seminar, so I won't say too much about it. But I think another hard truth this pandemic is making us face is that we do not look after our older people very well in this country. And, you know, we have not had an honest conversation about what the state can do and where that should start and stop. And personally, I don't think the state does enough. What that means for families, what we expect of families, how that load gets disproportionately taken up by women, how it impacts women in their 50s and their career paths and their pension arrangements, you know, particularly if you're a woman on a low income. I mean, what do you do when you're in your 50s and you've got a parent who needs care, but you can't afford to give up work and you don't have a pension? These are impossible decisions, and it is a whole other seminar, but there are very, very big, important questions about how we look after older people in our society that we have come nowhere close to answering in the last kind of 10 years.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Julia. I think I'd agree with Sonia. I mean, for single parent families, the lockdown has been an absolute nightmare. And I think certainly in our experience, of course, some people have become single parents during this pandemic through bereavement. And I think that's where organisations, certainly in my own experience, we have been able to, you know, step in and support people during incredibly challenging times. And I think that's where, it sounds a little bit corny, I know, but living our values, showing that we care has really mattered. And I think in those circumstances, I think people, you know, it's about reaching out to support people during a life-changing experience, what for some has been a life-changing experience. So absolutely, you know, really difficult during these times. The point about, I'm not going to comment on government, but, you know, in terms of walking the talk, I think what's been also very interesting is from a kind of flexibility perspective and having sort of flexibility in terms of where people have worked. I mean, we were all overnight forced to work from home. For those of us who generally come into an office in the city. But for many senior people, of course, that was something they had never done. Certainly in my experience, a lot of our very, very senior folk were in the office every day. So working from home was an interesting challenge for many of them, and actually being much more visibly present with their families and getting to know their families an awful lot better. So I think we've had a whole variety of experiences of some of our people working from home, but I think what that has done has enabled them to understand the challenges and experiencing what life for other people are like when they're trying to juggle responsibilities. So it's really quite interesting. Our senior partner here at PwC, who was always in the office and always on, has now committed to working more from home because they have realised that it is doable. And those people who work from home aren't working from home in inverted commas, they're actually working from home and being very productive because you can. So there's an upside in some of this in terms of, you know, experiencing the reality of greater flexibility and that it can work for organisations.
Thank you very much, James.
On the intersectionality bit, I think that's very interesting and necessary to talk about. We talk about this research and we've broadened, well, we've kept it umbrella to the extent that we just talk about people with parent or caring responsibilities rather than going too far into the various aspects. So generally when we conduct research that looks at either sandwich caring responsibilities, so caring for both children and for parents, or for the parents of children who have special or complex needs, absolutely the pressure is greater, the perceptions are lower. And I think particularly at the moment, when you either think about the fact that if you have disabled children, you'll have been shielding for a very long period of the year, therefore the onus would have to be on your organisation to be even more flexible. At the moment, if you have elderly parents, then do you want to send your children back to school? Are they going to get ill? Are you then going to pass that on to different generations? The needs are increasingly complex. And so, as I say, the onus is on the organisation to show empathy, yes, to Sarah's point, but empathy plus for these people, because they're in a much more complex and a much more challenging situation. In terms of the point about walking the talk, I think this is where the experience of organizational leaders and government leaders probably differs a little bit. I think the government is slightly damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they're working all hours, then they're not supporting their children. If they're chillaxing, as Mr. Cameron used to do, then they're being told they haven't got their hands sufficiently on the tiller of the things that are hitting our country. Company leadership don't have that to the same extent, but certainly employees look to their leaders. They look to their leaders to role model the right behaviors, to role model the right values, and they look to their leaders to communicate kind of consistently and persistently. And so if leaders are not only behaving in the right way in their own small boxes, but also are then talking about those experiences, and are talking about it both the female and the male leadership as well, because those stories, that narrative needs to come from employees from all sorts of different backgrounds and characteristics. That's when you get the very powerful signposting to employees that this is okay, this is something they can do too, because people at the very top of the organization are doing those things as well. So it is very important that the leaders not only do those things, but talk about it as well.
Thank you very much. I'm going to thank Jolie, who is flying fingers and putting statistics through for us on the Q&A line. Jolie says the Office of National Statistics published data yesterday, which found that the number of redundancies increased by 45% this quarter compared to the last financial quarter, with a 79% increase in redundancies for women compared to the previous quarter. So statistics, powerful, not good news in any respect, but powerful statistics to know. Our time has now grown very short. We're in the last 5 minutes. So I want to conclude by doing one whiz back through the panel and to ask you if you could get out your crystal ball and predict in, say, 2 years' time, what's one thing that could have gone well, that you know, you've got a degree of optimism will go well, and what's one thing you think we will be very focused on as a problem. So a sort of positive and a negative to think about in this area of gender diversity work and our reactions to COVID and beyond. So I can see puzzled faces. You're thinking deeply on it, which is fantastic. James, I'll go to you first and then come back through.
Lovely. I have the least time to think, but I think in terms of something that will have gone well, I do think that whilst we've been talking about the kind of the negative aspects of this research, what it does show is that organizations are continuing to progress their thinking. If we think about 5 years, 10 years ago, it would have painted a very different picture to the research we have now, and now in a very challenging pinch point. So I do think that the next 2 years we'll see continual progress towards either more equitable policies around flexible home working, or even potentially more equitable outcomes for employees, either from different genders or from different characteristics around caring responsibilities. I think the thing that we now see a movement to, and that we will continue to be raising as a challenge, is organizations trying to keep a handle on how they keep that culture and the behaviors of organizations together in what will be a fairly prolonged period of either remote or fairly disparate working. People who are entering the workforce, people who are still joining these organizations now, are joining over Zoom, are having all of their induction periods over Zoom. The only time they can actually get a sense of the organization, in general terms, I know people are still going into the office and increasingly so, is remotely. And therefore, what you're going to see is a lot of people who maybe don't have that same shared experience in the initial time of the organization as others. And that will be an interesting challenge for organizations to face. How do they retain some of the positive aspects they've seen in the past 6 months moving forward, or how do they retain the things that were there beforehand that they don't want to lose?
Thank you very much. Fantastic answer. Sarah.
Thank you, Julia. So in terms of, I am an optimist because I like a full glass. And I am quite optimistic that this will facilitate what we've been focused on for so long, which is about greater flexibility, particularly in the business world. And I guess enabling us to get to a position where blended learning, blended working from home, working at the office or whatever, does become more of a norm. As James said, we've just literally, in my organisation, we're inducting this week 1,300 students who have joined the firm. They've never been into one of our offices. And we hope that whilst they're being inducted virtually, they will be coming into one of our 24 offices over the coming weeks. All the offices have been made safe, but obviously it's very much down to them. It's optional. But I think this whole blended approach, work finally being seen as something you do, not where you do it, which has been a sort of a hackneyed expression, you know, which people roll out whenever we talk about work-life balance or flexibility. But I think it could become, and let's hope, and I'm optimistic it will become more of a reality. What I'm really worried about is young people and transition from education, school, university into work, and particularly young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. And there was a recent a report launched yesterday actually by the Social Mobility Commission. I am very worried that for many young people, they will find it hard to get work experience, particularly paid work experience, if work experience is all going to go virtual. And they're going to struggle to get access to work, to jobs, and so I think we need to do. I think the government needs to. We all need to do more to focus on certainly the 18 to 24-year-old population.
Thank you very much, Sonia.
So quickly, I would totally agree with that. For me, one of the worst aspects of the pandemic has been the total lack of policy, creativity, investment and energy that has gone into mitigating the impact of the pandemic on children and young people. But in terms of, so what I'm optimistic about is I do think that shift of attitudes at the sort of grassroots level amongst millennial men and women who are becoming parents, I think that will continue to shift. And I thought what Sarah said actually about men, even if women are doing more of the pulling of the weight, we know from surveys when it comes to stuff like homeschooling, I think men being present more at home and seeing what it involves is absolutely not a bad thing. You're right. And I know men and fathers who sort of come to that, you know, view. So I think that's what will continue to shift in the right direction in the next 2 or 3 years. I don't think we're going to go backwards to a time where dads want to take us more of a step back. So that's positive. In terms of what's negative, I'm pessimistic, first of all, because I think actually we are going to see a transition to a different type of economy. I don't have a problem with, in fact, I think it's good if people work from home more. I think it's great for environmental reasons, but I do think it's much easier if you're in a white collar job than a blue collar job. So I think we'll see inequalities open up around that. But I think it is also going to involve a transition, which is going to impact quite negatively on sectors like hospitality and services and retail in city centres. And it's predominantly women who do those jobs. So I'm quite worried about the structural impacts of that sort of economic transition on gender equality. And I think it's a sort of change that is inevitable, because I think this is what modern living and working will look like. But we know that when economies undergo these sorts of changes, you have to have really concerted effort from governments to retrain, reskill, to make sure that people losing jobs that are going by the wayside don't just never work again. And I have no faith in this government to do that. And that relates to my sort of broader, more pessimistic point, which I think there's so much of this stuff requires policy change, as I said, not just good employers. And I'm afraid I don't have that much faith in this government in the next 3 years to deliver the sort of radical transformative change that we need to be ahead of the curve, because I think they are just going to be completely mired. First of all, in managing the wake of the pandemic, which obviously we can all have sympathy for them on, but also on a totally self-made crisis, which is Brexit. I'm going to leave it there.
There's that Brexit word back again. We'd sort of stopped saying it for a while, but it is back a bit. But we certainly talk about the pandemic a lot more. Can I conclude at that point? Our time flew by. That's been a fantastic conversation. Sonia, Sarah, very big thanks to you for participating in this discussion. James, thank you to you for participating in the discussion, but thank you to you, to Carrie and Box, for being such a fantastic partner in this research. We're very grateful to you. And thank you to everybody who joined us for this webinar. We're delighted to have had your company. Thank you for such great questions on the Q&A line. And at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you for joining us for this event.